Hi, and welcome to our Founders Question slot, where we dig into the real challenges founders face. Today, I'm with Ian from Focus 15, so let's get to it. Hi, Ian. So, here's a question that came from Mick in Manchester. A lot of people toy with the idea of starting a company, but they aren't sure whether they've got what it takes. So, how do you figure out if you're really cut out to be a founder?
Hi Nick, that's a good question. And the truth is, I guess you don't really know until you try. You're going to hear a lot of people, investors, successful founders, give you the impression that you've got to sell your grandparents or, climb Everest in flip-flops, or in Elon Musk's case, you've got to eat glass. But it's all a bit of chest beating. And whilst the sentiment is right, because it is really hard to be a founder, and there are sacrifices you've got to make, it's not quite that dramatic. Now, I always think that a lot of people get super excited about the idea. They believe that light bulb moment is what it's all about. That's it. That's the big thing. But great ideas fail all the time. And whilst it's critical, running a business is actually a bit like snakes and ladders on ice with no actual finish line. It's constant ups and downs. It's sacrifices along the way. So for me, perhaps the most important thing to understand is a founder's motivation, because that dictates what they're prepared to sacrifice. So ask yourself some serious questions. Will you invest all your savings to make it happen? Are you going to spend all your time on it when you could be out with family and friends having a great time? Are you going to mind, going down the supermarkets and having all the yellow stickered food, or your car being the oldest one in the street and all the jobs around the house getting left for another day? And more importantly, how does your partner feel about it? Because they've got to go through it with you. Steve Jobs once said, "I'm convinced that about half of what separates successful entrepreneurs from unsuccessful ones is pure perseverance." And that perseverance comes, in my opinion, from the strength of that motivation. We tend to hear a lot about people when they've become successful, but we don't often hear or seldom hear about the struggle to get there. But in my view, there's no real such thing as an overnight success. If you take James Dyson, for example, multi-billionaire, had to make over 5,000 prototypes that failed before he perfected his vacuum cleaner. He spent years in debt, remortgaging his home to fund the development. That's hard. Colonel Sanders of KFC, it took him over 10 years to sell his recipe. Rejected by over 1,000 restaurants before he finally agreed to franchise it. J.K. Rowling, another example, Harry Potter, wrote that while she was living on welfare, and it took over a year and 12 rejections to find a publisher. And even then, they were only willing to publish 1,000 copies. And the editor advised her to get a job because she'll never make a living out of writing books. More fool him. The list goes on. Massively successful people. Unbelievable motivation to endure those rejections and carry on. They're not necessarily the best or the brightest, although many, I think, would like to think they are. They're not. But beneath their talents, they've got this incredible motivation and they refuse to go away. So obviously you need good ideas, and you need a strong skill set as well. You need to be comfortable with uncertainty. You need to accept the responsibility that goes with being a founder. That you've got to make decisions, you've got to execute. You've got to cope with this to-do list that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. But you've still got to focus on the right things. And you need a healthy dose of luck. All that matters. But underneath the foundation is the motivation. That's the thing that when the going gets tough, that's what's going to determine whether you give up, look for an easier path, or you carry on. So going back to the original question, are you cut out to be a founder? I think the real thing you need to answer is, do you have the right motivation to succeed?
That's all for this edition of Founders Questions, and thanks to Ian for sharing his insights. Don't forget, if you have any questions you'd like answering, just pop them in the comments, and we'll do our best to bring you the answers in a future recording. In the meantime, stay focused and see you soon.